So next we are going to add a select field to see how this looks. And we're going to call this department. Okay. Now, as we can see, the initial fields here are exactly the same. Our name, symbolic name, and optional hint. We can also change the type at this point. But underneath we can see that the values section appears. And what this will allow us to do is pre-populate a series of options for the select field, determining what will appear in the drop-down. So with department here, let us say something like human resources, IT, marketing, customer services. Now these are going to be the values that are available within the drop-down. Underneath that, again, we can see very similar functions with the required, disabled, and reload the form when changing. I'm not going to make this disabled. We obviously want to be able to configure and select which option we want to, we are planning to determine which department we are a part of. Now you might notice as well, there is a default value field. This currently is empty and something that we cannot select. And the reason for this is when any field requires our own input values, at this time, the system needs to register those values before we can select a default. So for instance, if I was to hit save now, unlike with the text strings, where it showed me the page directly, it's still going to remain on the field properties pop-up. But what we will see is that each value now has a reference number next to it to show effectively its value. It's where it aligns in the overall structure here. With that now selected, we can see, of course, that we can define one of these values to be default. So what I would like to do in a required aspect is, instead of it being something like one of these default values, we would select the please select to be the default. And this simply won't be considered as a populated value, therefore meaning that you will have to choose one of those options when defining the field to be required. So that's what we're going to do here. Another option we can see is the use advanced UI for selecting elements, which is something I will showcase in just one second. So we'll just hit save now. Done. And of course we can see we now have the option to select from these in our select list. Now, as I mentioned, there is the advanced UI, and what that will allow us to do is change the functionality of this slightly. It can come in handy when we need to define a large amount of choices, or we are presented with a large amount of choices in that value, and making it easier to select or locate the appropriate one. So for instance, if I select edit of this field, which is the pen icon here, and go and define that we want this to have the advanced UI, hit save now. Visually, we can see there is no real change at this point, but if I go to the drop down, we can see that this initial search item appears at the top of our drop down, meaning that we can pinpoint and identify a specific item, which is very good for, as I mentioned, a large amount of values that you would apply to a select field like this. So if I start typing in human, it's going to pinpoint and locate only that option. As we've only got 4 selections, not necessarily needed, so let's change back to the standard there. Okay. Now, the next feature we are going to add is a user list, but before I do, this is where we're going to look at applying one of our advanced rules. So we won't see that just now, but further on, what we are going to do is, with this department field once more, we're going to edit it very quickly. We are also going to define to reload this form on changing. And we'll see how that works in a later part. But for now, we're just going to make sure that this field is going to reload the form on changing.